be used by you to bring the messages to us. And so as we learn a little bit more about how you work through her, I pray that you'll guide our minds. Be with me as I lead in the discussion, I pray in Christ's name. Amen. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, I wasn't sure what I was even going to do when I got here. If there's some that were not here yesterday, I don't know. But that was because I'd sent them this big handout, and I didn't know if it was copied. It was, though there was a mistake, and that's why we've got more copies here. So if anybody came in more recently and needs a copy of the document, why, we have plenty now. Anyway, we're going to go through the rest of this document that we started yesterday, and then I'm going to switch gears and do Adventist history. Since the title was A Heritage Worth Talking About, as I said yesterday, that was a wide open door, because when I sent it to him weeks ago, the last thing I was thinking about was this camp meeting. You have so many appointments and stuff to do in between that you just kind of give them a wide open door and hope something will fit. So anyway, yes, sir.
You mentioned what the midnight cry was yesterday, and I caught half of it.
Okay.
Get the whole thing.
What the midnight cry was. Let's wait until we get back to Millerites, and we'll come back into that. Okay, and if I don't cover it then when we get to Millerites, because what I want to do after we finish this document is I do want to talk about the heritage of the church. And we're going to start with, yes, please, help yourself. We're going to start with a broader picture that we don't usually talk about to remind you that God was working around the world. Then we're going to talk about William Miller, and whatever we don't get through today, we'll pick up tomorrow, and we'll do some more, and how we got the Sabbath and some other things worked in. It's from a historical perspective. But we're going to start on page 38 of the document that we were working. Do you need one of these papers? Actually, if I were smart, I'd put them in the back. I'd also have that attached better. I may need mine, just may, I don't know. And here they get to do a picture of me putting this on. Won't that be fun for you all to buy? I could hardly wait, you know. Get a copy myself. All right, so yesterday, if there were some here today that weren't here yesterday, we were talking about how God worked through Ellen White. And we reviewed how visions came, the contents of visions, how God gave the information. And we are now ending this paper with a look at how, or why, I should say, Ellen White used other sources as she was writing her books. So I've tried to give you the footnotes and the quotes from the documents, etc., so you can see I'm not just, spinning this out of whole cloth. I'm actually working on something here with footnotes and documents and quotes to let you see where I'm getting my information. So we're on page 38, and everybody should have 38 today, though I know half of you didn't yesterday, but you should have it today. And a third reason that Robert Olson, the retired director of the White Estate, gave in a booklet he put out about 20-some years ago, was that at times the Lord led her, Mrs. White, to the discovery of useful and beautiful gems in the works of other authors. And then there's a statement by Ellen White's son, W.C. White, and son-in-law. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, what qualification W.C. White have?
He was a son.
Son for the writing, this kind of things. Was he trained, or how he acquired to?
Well, he lived with his mother from his birth until her death in 1915. After James White died in 1881, he then worked closely with his mother from 1881 until 1915. Furthermore, on top of that, after he got back from Australia, even while he was in Australia, he exclusively devoted himself to helping her with her books, the production of the books, not the writing, but the production, the publishing, that kind of. So if there was anybody in the church that knew how his mother put her books together, it was W.C. White. And so that's why we use him as such a valuable source. It parallels what she says, but she doesn't write a lot about how she did her work. We showed a few quotations yesterday from where she actually talks about how a vision came, etc. But Willie White, who was an observant, growing up all of his life around his mother, is probably the best expert that we have in terms of reporting on what she did, how the secretaries worked, all that kind of thing, because he worked so closely with his mother.
Wasn't he also an ordained pastor?
Oh yeah, he was an ordained minister. The two sons that grew up, Edson White and Willie White, were both also ordained ministers. But I don't know that necessarily would answer your question. I mean, the credibility and why we look to him for his suggestions and his comments and his descriptions is because of his day-by-day interaction with his mother all those years.
But the content of his writing is very good.
Well,
I mean,
he may have run things through a secretary too. I don't know. Okay. I mean, I'm not aware that he did. He never wrote any books, so I don't know that he did. But
had you caught, and that's very.
Oh yeah, he could write. He was articulate. He had an education. Was there a hand over here somewhere? Okay. Anyway, so the third reason is that the Lord led her to the discovery and use of beautiful gems or beautiful quotations in the works of other authors. And about halfway through that quotation from W.C. White, and I was going to say also that Doris Robinson, D.E. Robinson, married Ellen White's oldest granddaughter. And he was a secretary. Doris Robinson was a secretary for Ellen White for several years early in the last century, and also was closely, not as much as W.C. White obviously, but closely linked with Ellen White because he also married into the family. So the two of them authored something that came out in the review, and it says here in the middle of that, she was told that in that paragraph, middle of that paragraph, she was told that in the reading of religious books and journals, she would find precious gems of truth expressed in acceptable language, and that she would be given help from heaven to recognize these and to separate them from the rubbish of error with which she would sometimes find them associated. And then here is another quotation, which is of interest. The next one there, second line. Here was not, talking about Ellen White, here was not, however, a case of one void of the thought she wished to present and consulting books for the purpose of finding themes upon which she might write. On the contrary, abundant light had been given her, and she was looking for helpful and concise forms of expression and for gems of truth tersely expressed, or, very, very clearly and short presentation. Going down to the next paragraph, the end of it, in some instances, or the middle of it I should say, in some instances, these sentences that she may have taken were enclosed in quotation marks, and in some instances they were not, especially where she paraphrased the work to better express her thoughts. Mrs. White's copying from others was not a necessity, but was done chiefly to conserve time in the interest of brevity and forcefulness. Now, if you're awake, you may be thinking, well, when I was in school and I wrote a term paper, I don't think my teacher would have liked it very much if I had said, well, you know why I borrowed all this stuff from other people? It's not because I didn't know I had all these thoughts. It was just easier. So is there some evidence? Ellen White is not alive. We can't get into her brain. But do we have some evidence that would support what Willie White says is how and why his mother worked this way, taking some language from others? And yes, on the next page is one or two examples, and there are others that we could give, but I've just included these. In the left column, this is J.A. Wiley's description of Lake Zurich. And on the right column is Ellen White's private diary. All right, so what happened was Ellen White and her party there in Switzerland, well, they're there in the 1880s, they go out and they have a nice day around Lake Zurich in Switzerland. She comes back home. Now, if you keep a personal diary, I don't know that any of you do, but if you do keep a personal diary every day, what do? You sit down and you write out kind of your reflections, or if it's a dear diary, you share everything that you ever thought that day, depending on what kind of a diary it is. Now, Ellen White also kept diaries. And in this case, she was at Lake Zurich. She saw how beautiful it was at Lake Zurich, but instead of just sitting down in her own private diary, not for publication now, this is her own private diary, she remembered having read Wiley's description of Lake Zurich. And rather than trying to come up with the words herself, she pulls his book off the shelf and she copies from his book a description of Lake Zurich for her diary. And on mine, I have actually highlighted word by word, every single word that is word by word from, this is Wiley, and here's Ellen White's private diary. Oh, sorry, the diary, that's right, sorry. And then this is Wiley over here, right, sorry. So I have marked on mine, and it's one line off too. If it was pushed up one line, then you can see Zurich is pleasantly situated, etc. Now here's a case where obviously she saw Lake Zurich. She was there at Lake Zurich. But as Willie said, it was easier for her just to take a description that she'd read somewhere else. It's not that she hadn't been there and that she hadn't seen it herself. She could have forced herself to do it, but why? She'd see this beautiful description in Wiley's writing, so she just uses his language. Now, Willie White, and we have other examples of this, I just put one on the paper. Willie White knew the source of his mother's information. So he's not questioning when she's borrowing from others because he is convinced. He's watched day after day after day. And here's something he wrote to his cousin, Frank Belden. Frank Belden was the hymn writer. Okay, you may or may not have known that Frank Belden's mother was Ellen White's older sister, Sarah. So Frank Belden and W.C. White were first cousins. And Frank Belden was in Battle Creek working at the Review, and he had this, I don't know if he thought he had an inside track with his aunt or what, but anyway, he'd send stuff down here. This was happening in Battle Creek, and that's going on, and so-and-so did this, and all that kind of thing. And finally, Willie White apparently gets tired of his cousin sending all this stuff over to Ellen White, and so he writes to his cousin. He says, "It's not necessary that you, or Edson," that would be Ellen White's son, Edson White, "it's not necessary that you or Edson or any other person shall give particulars regarding the work at Battle Creek in order to get Mother's counsel. The matters which transpire there are laid open before her clearly from time to time." He goes on to say she's writing frequently, laying out principles. He knows the source of the vision. So even when she's borrowing, like we've seen up here, where she will sometimes, because it conveniently says what she wants to say, she'll borrow other language, but she's got the thought. She knows. It's not a case of a student writing a term paper who says, "Help! I got to go out and borrow all this, plagiarize all this, whatever word you want to use, all this stuff, because I'll never get the assignment done by next Friday when it's due," that kind of thing. That's not the case. Now, in this whole discussion that's been going on in our church for the last 25, 30 years about Ellen White's use of sources, and it kind of goes up and down at various times, but it's always on the internet and the negative websites, the study of the dissimilarities needs to be undertaken as well as the similarities. Most of what study has been done has been to show the parallels. But there are times when Ellen White borrows the language from somebody else, but she uses it to say exactly the opposite. Again, showing that she knows what she believes and what she thinks and what she wants to say, but in fact, she's using language from another source that's making another point entirely. Going on to the next page. Several years ago, the staff at the White Estate, this is before I joined them, but the staff at the White Estate did a study of the several chapters in Desire of Ages. But Robert Olson, then the director, did the chapter on the resurrection of Lazarus, chapter 58, Lazarus Come Forth. And one discovery that he mentions of interest is in the extra-biblical account of the return of the messenger who had reported to Jesus on Lazarus' illness. Of the six, now remember the Bible doesn't say what exactly happens, what time it all happened, but one of the six, who make any comment, Abbott, Edersheim, Farrar, Hannah, March, Macmillan, all who'd written Lives of Christ, they all agree that the messenger returned to Mary and Martha after Lazarus died. Ellen White, who had all their books in her library, and we know from sources, work that Dr. Veltman did, that sometimes would use language from them, Ellen White is the only one who says that Lazarus was still alive and died later. So here again, even though we know from other research that's been done that she would sometimes use the language from these people, here's a case where she's just going a different direction. She is not forced by the source to change her view, is what I'm trying to say. It is clear that even when she employed the language of others in their description of an event, she did not just blindly follow everything they said. Now, again, there's another comparison, and I won't take time to go through all of this, but you will find on this and the next page one of her most important statements on inspiration. She is using the language of Calvin Stowe, but she is going exactly the opposite direction, even though she's using his phraseology. He believed in verbal inspiration. Ellen White believed in thought inspiration. She likes the way he uses the language to talk about inspiration, but every time he goes off on his view of verbal inspiration, she just switches the language and changes it to her viewpoint. So she's picking up his language, his words, but not his thoughts. That's what I'm trying to point out that she would do. All right, so you can look at those at your convenience. So here's Dr. Veltman's, page 42. Dr. Veltman, who we mentioned yesterday, spent these 8 or 9 years studying, 7 or 8 years studying Ellen White. Here was his conclusion about Ellen White's use of sources, top of page 42. There is no question that she, Ellen White, used sources, but she was selective. She evidently was governed by her own purposes and priorities. And here's the sentence. The sources were her slaves, never her masters. In other words, she used them to her advantage. If they use words, put words together in a way she liked. But she went her own direction in terms of what she believed, what she wrote, what she taught. Then he says, to deny her indebtedness to literary sources or to underplay their influence would, in my judgment, not be a fair assessment of the evidence. But to stress the literary borrowing to such an extent that Ellen White's special contributions as a writer and as a messenger for the content she wished to communicate are severely downplayed or denied is also, in my opinion, an inaccurate evaluation of the evidence. In other words, if we get all caught up in this source study business and miss the whole message, that would not be fair either. And then the last, which is a short one, is Ellen White also appropriated some of the doctrinal writings of her fellow workers. And we saw that she said she did that in the introduction to Great Controversy that we looked at yesterday. It's very interesting. A number of years ago, there was big buzz. I can remember I was a young fellow in the church working not too long after I started working for the White Estate. Big buzz. Did you know that Ellen White copied some of Uriah Smith in Great Controversy? Duh. That's what she said she was going to do. Why, what a clever idea. Ellen White's honest. She actually did what she said she was going to do. She borrowed from those other people that were primary, the pioneers in this movement. And we looked at that yesterday. So here is a little bit about that. That's the fourth reason that Bob Olson, Dr. Olson, gave in the book that he wrote, 101 Questions, about why she borrowed from other sources. Then at the bottom of the page, E, Ellen White's, or the White Estate's, inventory of known literary borrowing. If you have paid any attention to this, you know there are all kinds of charges going around as to what percentages of Ellen White's books come from other sources. A number of years ago, this was back when Elder Arthur White was still alive, the White Estate decided that they would get a brand new set of all of Ellen White's major books. You know, the publishing houses sometimes bring out 5 chapters of this and call it a pamphlet of something else. Not that, but all the major books. We bought a set and decided that we would mark every single parallel that we found or that anybody ever sends us that they found in their research between Ellen White and some other source. And this again was before I was there, but I was told that Arthur White said about this set of books, he said, why don't we call this set of books Project Surprise? We may be surprised, there may be more borrowing than what we believe, or the critics may end up being surprised, there may be a lot less borrowing than what they claim, but either way somebody's going to be surprised. So why don't we call this set of books Project Surprise? So our set of Project Surprise books are listed here on the page 43. What percentages? If you look down through this, now this has everything. We'll come to Desire of Ages separately. That book had that special study by Dr. Veltman, so it's not in this list. But we will come to that on the next page. But here, looking at it, if you look at the list, you will see that there are 2 books that have, or 3 books, I should say, that are over 10%. Well, 2 books and 3 headings there, 3 entries. Great Controversy, which if you add the 2 together, either in quotes or uncredited that have been found, 20.16%. Sketches from the Life of Paul, 12.23%. So 2 of Ellen White's books, and we'll find Desire of Ages does also, so it's really 3. 2 of Ellen White's books, as far as we at the White Estate know, there is more than 10% of borrowing. Now this borrowing can be, this is all the categories. Dr. Veltman had very strict parallels and then loose parallels and all these different varieties. We just put any parallel. So this is just a general, if there seems to be borrowing, we mark it in this set of books. Tim Poyer in his office keeps this set. So 2 books have more than 10%, 3 if you include Desire of Ages, which we'll get to in a minute. Then one other has from 5 to 9%, and that's Steps to Christ. Then there's 10 from 1 to 4%, 17 have 0.5 to 1%, and 13 more have less than 0.5%. Now you may have heard that she borrowed 85%. Or all kinds of things. We're not aware of it at the White Estate. Nobody has ever given us any evidence that would come anywhere near all those kind of percentages that you sometimes read. Yes, ma'am?
Is it very common among the authors? How about other kind of authors? Do they ever?
Actually, Dr. Veltman, I didn't put it in this paper, but in Dr. Veltman's report, he says that when he was studying these various lives of Christ, there was so much borrowing going on between all these 19th century authors that it was absolutely, in some cases, impossible to tell who even borrowed first from whom. It was not that uncommon, especially among religious writers, apparently, from what he found in his study of the lives of Christ. I'm not an expert on 19th century plagiarism, but what I do understand from what I've read is that even up to the 1850s or 60s, which does not cover all of Ellen White's life, for sure, her writing career, but up until that time, it was especially considered flattering if you quoted, whether or not you gave the reference. According to one author I was looking at, it was flattering that you would quote. I thought you were so important that what you said was worth including in my book. Now, of course, we're the exact opposite now. If you even hint at getting a thought from somebody else, you better have 17 footnotes down there to verify it so somebody doesn't call you on it, you know. But we've changed. And they were in the process of changing during Ellen White's life. Yeah.
In other words, other authors could have borrowed from her.
Right. That very clear that could have happened. We don't have any evidence except yesterday I mentioned this one guy who took the whole book and put his name on it. But, you know. Yeah.
Just kind of a question. I mean, is our generation, or very close to our generation, kind of the first or one of the first to be so individualistic in this? Because I know that in the New Testament, the first century plagiarism was pretty rife too. So, I mean, as far as Paul from Mark and Mark from Peter. And
Well, all the gospel writers go back and forth.
all from the Old
Right.
Testament. I mean, John, the book of Revelation is huge.
Again, I'm not an expert on literary borrowing or whatever you want to call it, so I don't know what it was down through the Middle Ages and all that. I assume it was pretty much like it still was in the early 19th century, that it was actually a form of flattery, that I thought you say something that's so important, I put it in my book, whether or not I give you credit. If somebody else can say, I got it from her, oh, well, you know, then I better get her book too, because this author thinks it's that important. But that's all changed, obviously. Now, it was changing by the end of Ellen White's life. There's no question that things were changing. And especially since then, it's changed a lot. I mean, obviously now, you know, every once in a while, there's some expose out there about some great American even that has written, and then is, oh, that person plagiarized that whole speech from so-and-so, or plagiarized the book from so-and-so. So it's obviously, it's a different viewpoint today, yeah.
Our women's group studied Deuteronomy one year, and most of what Jesus said is there.
And not
That was
and not always footnoted either.
We thought Deuteronomy would be pretty dull and boring, and we found it really exciting.
Well, he obviously did too. So. Okay, so this is just a listing for you. Now this is dated November 30, 2001. I asked Tim Poyer a year or so ago, is it worth retyping this page? Has it changed that much? And he said, oh, you know, it may be a fraction of a percent that we found in the last 9 years, but no, basically he said you can still make your presentation and you're not going to embarrass yourself, that we've got a lot more information. So I give that to you. It may be a very small fraction of a percentage change from that since 2001 when I got those figures from him. Yeah.
Well, certainly great controversy is the most where quotations are, and that's 15%, which is hardly anything. I would have expected it to be much higher than that, considering the historical content of the GC. And so is this 15% above and beyond what wasn't already referenced from Fox's or?
No, that's what you see. There's two there. There's one that's credited, and then so in quotes is the 15%.
Okay, so
That's the 15%. And then above that, the uncredited, they have actually come up where she's not using necessarily a historical fact, but she's actually apparently using parallel language that we have been given to us another 5.05% that's marked in this set of books. Now that may grow at some point in the future, but it hasn't been growing recently. Much of this research was done, 20, 25 years ago. That's when everybody was into this. And the critics still take some of the charges that were being made by people back 20, 25 years ago as fact, but I'm just telling you what we know. And if somebody's got other facts out there, they haven't shared it with us. And if they did, we would certainly start. As I was talking one time with a critic, I said, do you really think that I've got some insight when it comes to the judgment? That I'm going to knowingly stand up there and, lie to you? Well, he kind of looked at me. So we will, if we had if somebody gave us something and we found the evidence different, we would increase the percentage, because this is what we know. That's all I'm trying to share with you, is what the facts that we have. Yes, sir.
The point that you made about the literary custom of borrowing and then crediting is good for people to know, critics to know, especially because they take this out of context. This little bit.
Well, we do this not just with Ellen White. I mean, we do this with a lot of things. We try to impose our view on all. You read lots of stuff where people are imposing our view back onto people that lived 100 years ago, 150 years ago, or the founders of the country, etc. And it's interesting to see the contrast. But it's really fairest treat people in their own context, understand them where they're coming from in their own context, rather than trying to impose what we believe, what we think on generations, 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago, and think they should have known this. Well, yeah, but you look at what they knew compared to 500 years before that, and they're making progress. And let's hope time doesn't last, but if it does 100 years from now, I hate to think what they'll come back and say about what little we know, because all the light they then have, you know. So, yeah.
This is a matter of information. In one of her books, one of her quotes is from a Dr. Kinney, and he was talking about when the day went dark. Happens to be one of my relatives on my mother's side.
Is that so? Well, so we...
Repeat that, because I couldn't get it all. No. Yeah.
Well, somebody that she quotes from in one of her books about the dark day of May 19, 1780, was the author that she quotes from is a relative, an ancestor, or some way related to him on his mother's side.
You know, my dad.
No, I don't know your dad.
He's still alive.
Oh.
He's 95. And we were talking about this one night, and I was telling where prophecy had been, where this had been fulfilled. He said, you know, my grandfather told me about this. And he said, Grandpa always told us, stay away from them Catholics. I hope there's no Catholics here. Daddy is hard-shell Baptist. He's really Adventist. He just doesn't know it. But he said, Grandpa never told us why. He just said, you know, they're the beast powers, stay away from them. But he never told his family why. And I said, well, Daddy, let me tell you why.
Okay, well, let's get away from the beast power. That's not the topic of this seminar. But, and actually, you know, there were discussions back 100 years ago about Ellen White's use of sources. Canwright brings it in. It's interesting that when some of the critics like to quote Canwright and his charges against Ellen White, they conveniently forget that Canwright plagiarized an entire book. He added to it, but he took almost the entire book by Moses Hull, The Bible from Heaven, and about 15 years later, he brought out a book because Hull had left the church and become a spiritualist, and so his book went out of circulation. So Canwright brings out a book called The Bible from Heaven, which he virtually quotes all of Hull's and then adds some more, and doesn't give Hull any credit at all. But then he turns around and says Ellen White was a plagiarist. So it's a very interesting discussion when you get into all this and start looking at it historically. Let's go to page 44. I want to get through this and get to talking about history, and not this kind of history just by itself. Now, we're looking at Desire of Ages. Desire of Ages, as far as we know at the White Estate, and this is based on Dr. Veltman's extensive research that we talked about yesterday. Here's what he says. He studied 15 chapters out of Desire of Ages. He'd still be at it. Well, no, he died a year or two ago. But other than that, he would still be at it if he was trying to do the whole book, I think. This in-depth page, word by word and phrase by phrase. 31% had some dependence upon other sources, while 61% did not. And the remaining balance was quotes from Scripture. And then this 31% included everything from very loose paraphrase to a few more extensive verbatim parallels. Most of the dependency fell into what he could describe as simple paraphrase. Only 30 sentences, or on average of 2 sentences per chapter, were considered simple verbatim. No sentence rated strict verbatim. So in other words, in the 15 chapters that he analyzed, there's not one sentence that completely was taken from another source. So it's all this other, whether it's strict or loose or whatever, verbatim. Now, when I was a kid growing up in the church, and maybe some of you that have been members for years, you'll remember that people, maybe you don't, maybe you were fortunate never told this. I was told that one of the marks of Ellen White's inspiration was that she could write a book of the quality of Desire of Ages, the literary beauty of Desire of Ages. I think from what we know from the study over the last 20, 25 years about how Ellen White used secretaries and borrowed language from other places, that that's probably not a good defense for Ellen White's inspiration. Now, how she takes you to Christ, now you may want to say that's inspired. I have no problem with that. But the literary beauty itself, and I want to read these 2 paragraphs because I'm trying to explode a myth that I had to grow up with and I don't believe anymore. It's unfortunate that the myth has grown up that Ellen White was an uneducated person. So that's the first thing we've got to get rid of. In terms of formal schooling, it is true that she was uneducated. But then so were Abraham Lincoln and most of his contemporaries, many of whom achieved greatness during their lives because of self-education. You know, what did Lincoln have? Was it 3 grades of education or something? He had. Who wrote what is still generally regarded in lists I see as the greatest speech in the English language? Abraham Lincoln. Well, he didn't get that from just 3 grades of education, obviously. He was very widely read and had steeped himself in the language of the Bible as a boy. Ellen White's experience as a co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Her extensive travels to Europe and the South Pacific, as well as over most of the United States, and her extensive reading made her a highly knowledgeable person by 19th century standards. Evidence of this can be seen in her popularity as a temperance lecturer among Christian temperance groups. Her popularity as a speaker at Adventist gatherings. Let me say something about temperance. Do you know one time the circus came to Battle Creek? And the temperance, not Adventists, but the temperance people were so nervous about all the citizens of Battle Creek going out to the circus. They decided they had to do something to try to keep these people that were so deluded that they wanted to go out to the circus from going there. So what did they do? They asked Ellen White to speak. And they put up a tent in downtown Battle Creek. She was the competition to the circus. I mean, obviously this woman had something going. She was not just an uneducated hick, as we would say. So evidence of this can be seen in her popularity as a temperance lecturer among Christian temperance groups. And read that as Christian, not Adventist temperance groups, general Christian temperance groups. Her popularity as a speaker at Adventist gatherings, as well as her extensive writings of articles, books, and letters. Her literary assistance did improve her written materials, as we have seen, but the idea that God miraculously transformed a highly uneducated woman into some person with the ability to write a book like Desire of Ages is unfounded. Under the blessing of the Holy Spirit, her abilities were enhanced by her own hard work over the years, plus the further assistance of literary assistants. In short, God did not work a miracle when it came to Ellen White's writing abilities. Again, I'm not talking about the message. That's where I think the miracle is. Because I don't think you can read Desire of Ages with an open mind and not come away from this, as I said yesterday, knowing you've met Jesus. We're talking about the writing now. We're not talking about the content. In short, God did not work a miracle when it came to Ellen White's writing abilities. Rather, he allowed others the privilege and blessing of assisting Ellen White in preparing her writings before they were sent out. All right, so now a conclusion about, yes, ma'am.
God will not work a miracle in us in the promise that he gave us, that he would send the Holy Spirit to teach us all things unless we read his word.
That's true. If we don't do anything ourselves,
Have it in here,
he's not going to just...
bring it out.
That's true. That's true. All right, so the conclusion. What about all this? So we spent a couple hours yesterday and a little bit more time today looking at how she wrote her book. So what? Well, here's what Ellen White herself says about her writings. In these letters which I write, in the testimonies I bear, I am presenting to you that which the Lord has presented to me. I do not write one article in the paper expressing merely my own ideas. They are what God has opened before me in vision, the precious rays of light shining from the throne. It is true concerning the articles in our papers and in the many volumes of my books. So her claim is, however they were put together, this is what God gave me, the message, not the writing style, not the binding, not the illustrations, but the message came from God. Now W.C. White, what he says, regarding Mother's writings, I have overwhelming evidence and conviction that they are the description and delineation of what God has revealed to her in vision. I believe, skipping down a line, I believe that God has given her discernment to use that which is correct and in harmony with truth regarding all matters essential to salvation. Now, I underline that, essential to salvation, because you will find a few mistakes. There's no question. There are a few historical errors and other mistakes in Ellen White's writings. Nothing that has to do with your or my salvation. Bible scholars, which I'm not, I'm an Adventist historian, but Bible scholars tell me you find the same thing in the Bible. There are a few inaccuracies, but has nothing to do with our salvation. That's where God made certain that the messages he communicated with the prophets will help us. That's what we need to get us through. That's the purpose. Okay, the next paragraph starting in the third line. This is by W.C. White and D.E. Robinson, Ellen White's grandson-in-law. Truly, it will be a great misfortune if any reader, this is any reader of Ellen White's writings, shall allow the question of her use of some passages from the writings of others to blind his mind that he cannot appreciate the great truths which are invaluable to the church and the world today. And then Fred Veltman, who we've mentioned several times in his great study. After his 7 years, he says, the third line, Ellen White was above all a practical believing Christian. Her writings were written to inform and to build personal faith in and personal obedience to God's will as it comes to expression in his word, the Bible. And then some things that we might want her to be, but skipping down to the last 3 lines. She wasn't all these things we may want, but she was rather a woman of God drawn by his Spirit to call us back to himself, to his word and his ways, that living under the name of Christ we might glorify him before those who know him not. That's the conclusion he came to after his intense study of 7 years of just those 15 chapters in Desire of Ages. All right, any questions on the paper?
This is wonderful.
Well, I hope it's helpful. And since it keeps coming up and coming up and coming up, and the internet is all pervasive, I thought I would start with giving you some source material that would let you see there's another side to the picture from what you sometimes read. All right, now let's skip over to some Adventist history, which I must confess, my mother, who until just last few years has finally come to realize history is interesting, wondered for many, many years how she ever hatched a kid like me that loves history. But she did. I love history. So we're going to look back at Adventist history for a little while. How are we doing for time? Okay. And I know they're going to get a picture of all this, but I'm going to take a drink anyway. I want to start with from a place that most of us don't start when we study Adventist history, and that is the setting of the preaching of the first angel's message. Most of us, when we start thinking about Adventist history, if you've ever had a formal course on Adventist history, where do you begin? William Miller, right? The Millerite movement here in America. Well, I know that we Americans tend to think that the world revolves around the United States.
Does it?
Well, apparently, at least from God's perspective, it didn't. Because there is a much wider picture. And I'm not going to take a lot of time. Well, I'll take a little bit of time. I want to talk about some of the interesting characters that God used outside the United States. Then we'll either look at Miller today or we'll get into him tomorrow morning. I mean, we'll get to Miller, and I've already had a question or two about Miller. We'll try to remember to answer those tomorrow. I want to start with something else that we kind of blacklist today, and that is, some do, not all. The church doesn't officially, but some do. And that is the great signs that we have talked about historically. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755, and the dark day of May 19, 1780 that's been referred to, and the falling of the stars in 1833. Now, of course, the pioneers saw these as evidence that the time of the end, and again, this is not a theology study today, so I'm going to use some phrases that hopefully you all know, because we're Seventh-day Adventists, and I'm not going to use very many, but I will use a few, like the time of the end, which we believe happened, started in 1798, etc. I'm not trying to prove all those today. That's not the purpose of this particular seminar. I just want to look at some things that were happening at those times that historically we've talked about. And as time goes on, we tend to downplay. But why were they significant? And why did they play such an important role in the starting even of our church? Because 1755, that's 253 years ago. That seems like a long, long time. Now, first, think about it in terms of God's perspective. If you were going to take the width of this room as God's perspective, and again, this is not a discussion on the age of the earth, so we're going to say the earth's about 6,000 years old. If you hold a different view, that's fine. You express it in the archaeology seminar that's this afternoon. It's not a discussion for this time here, if you have that view, okay? So, if you look at this, cross here is about 6,000 years of age, well, the first 1,000 years is what? Roughly the life of who? Adam, right. He was not quite 1,000, but we're just doing this in kind of round figures. So I want to point out, number one, that 250 years, even from God's perspective, isn't quite that long ago. So about 3,000 BC coming down would be Adam died. 2,000 BC is roughly when Abraham was born. If you get here in the middle, what's that? That's about when David is born. You go down here another 1,000 years, and where are you? Christ. You go down another 1,000 years, and where are you? Did anybody study medieval history? Fall of Constantinople and that kind, and William the Conqueror in 1066, all that kind of stuff. So then you're getting yourself clear over here, and you then come down another 500 years, and where are you? Bang, bang, bang on a church door. Come on. Martin Luther, right. Then you come down a little bit further, and you get to 1755 and 1780 and 1833 and 1844, and really from God's perspective, even in short chronology, we're not talking a long time, and these signs are the ones that God's using. But that's not my main reason for still thinking they're significant. I do want to point out, though, that it's not, it's not from God's perspective like eons and eons ago. But let's look a little bit again at the Lisbon earthquake. and these others, and see why, if we can, understand why they were so significant to our pioneers and why they still have validity as far as I'm concerned. The Lisbon earthquake struck Lisbon, Portugal on Sunday, November 1, 1755. There were 3 quakes. The first was at 9:40 a.m., the second afterquake, strong one, at 10, and then a third big one at noon, and then, of course, many afterquakes after that. The 9:40 a.m. earthquake lasted 6 to 7 minutes. 6 to 7 minutes, that's what the historians tell us.
Do they know the velocity? You know, like now they say 6.5.
Oh, there's estimates, but I don't know what it is. I mean, who knows? What they could, I mean, you know, the Richter, Dr. Richter hadn't been born yet, so sorry about that.
You know, the severity, I guess.
Well, let me give you some ideas. Here's some statistics about the severity, okay? They estimate that 30,000 people were killed in the initial quake. It was felt over an area of 4 million square miles. It had a 700-mile radius, an area estimated to be 4 times the size of Europe. It was felt from the Azores to Italy, England to North Africa. Oscillations, you know, just little slight movements, tremors in the lake and the ponds were felt as far away as 1,800 miles up in Sweden and Finland. And of course they didn't have CNN, so nobody knew why all of a sudden the lake started. It would be a few days before the word would come while Lisbon was wiped out. In Morocco, and I get these all out of secular history books, okay? These are books that are reporting on the Lisbon earthquake. And you remember they just celebrated the 250th anniversary a few years ago, so some more books came out about it. In Morocco, a village of 8,000 to 10,000 people was swallowed up. Cadiz, Spain, it's reported to have had about a 60-foot tidal wave. Tsunamis were experienced as far away as England, a 6 to 9-foot tsunami. Antigua, which is 3,400 miles from Lisbon, had a 12-foot tsunami. Then with the afterquakes, an estimated 60,000 people perished in Lisbon. They ran down, after that first big quake, they ran out of the churches. Everybody was in church. One reason there were so many fatalities is because it was All Saints' Day and they were in church that morning when the quake hit. So they ran down into the harbor out on a new marble quay, which in one of the aftershakes went down in, and some estimate as many as 60,000 people perished when that happened. There was a 20-foot tidal wave that came back then and hit Lisbon. Another estimated book that I was reading said 70 to 100,000 people altogether died in Lisbon. And that was at a time when the population of Lisbon was estimated at 230,000. The headquarters of the Portuguese Inquisition was located in Lisbon. Its building collapsed in the earthquake. But the little Protestant church in Lisbon remained standing. Apparently that fact was didn't go unnoticed. An estimated 12,000 buildings were destroyed in Lisbon, either by the earthquake or the fire that followed the quake. But that's not why this quake is important. The reason the quake is important is because of the impact it had on Europe. People started being good. Frivolity was frowned upon. The King of France gave up his mistress. She didn't like that, according to one author I was reading. She didn't like the king just saying, ooh, I'm getting scared here. Look what God's doing. They all thought, of course, that it was God that was doing this, not just an act of nature that God was allowing to try to get people's attention. So she got so upset, she said she was going to give up her rouge or her makeup as an offering to the demon of earthquakes. The first anniversary of the earthquake was looked upon with dread. The King and Queen of Portugal took part in a day of penitence, national penitence. Papal nuncio conducted ceremonial feet washing, and the people felt that the Lord, I'm quoting now, the Lord was in the earthquake and that it was his angel that touched the waters. It's because of the spiritual impact, and also that's when they began to study, all kinds of things began to be studied after this earthquake. But it's because of the impact that the quake had. That's why it's important. And it sets the tone for what's going to happen. God is trying to bring about, if you believe the prophecies, which we as Adventists do, and we look at what's going to happen, God's trying to get people's attention, and he's allowing things to happen through nature that had not happened to that extent before. Now we come to the dark day, the great dark day of May 19, 1780. Centered in northeastern North America. I should tell you just for the fun of it. Some people collect coins, and some people collect stamps, and some people collect dolls, and I collect Adventist history. That's my collection. So I just throw this in for the fun of it. I was at an antiquarian book sale 2 or 3 years ago up in New Hampshire. I was leading a New England tour, and the tour ended, and I saw there was going to be a book fair on Sunday, and I thought, you know, I can detour there on, not the most direct way home, driving home, but I could go by this antiquarian book fair. And while I was there, I bought a big old Bible. It's about yay big, from the 1700s. And written right in there in the handwriting of that era, right there with family history and all, is May 19, 1780, the great day of the Lord. That's what we're going to talk about next, the dark day. Anyway, so I thought I needed that in my collection. Why, I don't know, but anyway, I did. But then why do people need that certain coin, you know, with just a little flaw in the date or whatever it is, and it's worth 10 times as much to them? So anyway, the next one we're going to talk about is the dark day of May 19, 1780. Centered in the northeastern North America, it came on between about 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. It was darkest between 11 and 1. It was so dark, according to contemporary eyewitness accounts, that 11:30, so 11:30, in a room with 3 windows, 24 panes each. You know, they didn't have big windows like this, they had those panes, but 24 panes, and they had 3 of those windows in a room, all open towards the southeast. A large print newspaper. Now again, large print newspapers, if you've seen newspaper headlines from the 1780s, they're like this. They're not great big things like they put now, you know. But even then, large print newspapers could not be read in the natural light. By 12 o'clock, according to this one source, the Boston Gazette of May 29, 1780, by 12 o'clock, the windows being still open, a candle cast a shadow so well defined on the wall as that profiles could be made. You know, the old silhouette things they used to make? It was so dark at noon that day that the shadow, you could line yourself up so you could do a profile, cut from the shadow on the wall. At 11, the darkness was so great, this is another source, that the fowls went to roost, the birds ceased to fly, the whippoorwills sang their evening songs. Schools broke up, everybody was scared, they thought this was the great day of the Lord. Of course, back in those days, people knew their Bibles much better than most people do today. Candles were called for, and people thought the day of judgment had arrived. That was the response. There was a Colonel Abraham Davenport, and I quote this from Connecticut Historical Collections, published in 1836. A Colonel Abraham Davenport, who was a member of the Connecticut legislature, he says, so everybody was wanting to adjourn, God's coming. I am against an adjournment. This is quoting him. I am against an adjournment. The day of judgments is either approaching or it is not. If it is not, there is no cause for an adjournment. If it is, I choose to be found doing my duty. I wish, therefore, the candles may be brought. And apparently the Connecticut legislature did not adjourn. But again, people took this as evidence that Jesus was about to come. The day of judgment was here. It's again not the fact that it occurred. And even discussions, was it natural? And some people say, well, it was probably a big forest fire somewhere up in Canada that nobody knows exactly where it was, but it wasn't all explored. I don't mean it didn't happen that way. I'm just saying that whatever means God used, natural or otherwise, the impact it was having on people. And they're looking at the Bible and looking at spiritual things and sermons that were being preached about getting ready for the day of the Lord. That's why that's significant, that May 19, 1780. Same thing with the falling of the stars, November 13, 1833. Now this one, again, I just mentioned that I collect Adventist history. A very good friend of mine, was asked by the editor of the Review recently to write an article, I should say, for the paper on the anniversary that's coming up in November of this year, 175th anniversary of the falling of the stars. So I walked into his office one day there at the White Estate, and I saw him looking at the E.G. White Encyclopedia, and I said, well, what are you doing? Oh, he says, Bill Knotts asked me to write this article on the anniversary of the falling of the stars. I said, oh, good. Well, let me bring you some source material. And I really didn't know how much source material I'd collected. But I found out I have 41 newspapers from 1833 mentioning the falling of the stars. And it's interesting to look through those. So I took them in, and he says, I really didn't want to write the article, but I have no excuse now, do I? I said, no, if he wants to know why it's still important and why people reacted the way they did, it's pretty clear in these newspapers. They saw the falling of the stars in 1833 as another sign of the pending judgment that God was about here. And they knew their Bibles, they knew the signs, and that's what they were preaching and talking, and even the newspapers talk about when they're reporting on, because they didn't know anything really about the falling of stars, the Leonids and all that astronomy. That's pretty much been studied all since 1833. It also brought about that as well as the religious awakening. Yes, ma'am?
Those days, the general population had some basic knowledge of the Bible.
Oh, of course.
That's why they...
Very much so.
they
Yes,
were
I agree.
sensitive to. Do you think that kind of things happens now? Would we gather that kind of expression from...
In some parts of the world, but probably not the United States. But there are some parts of the world where I think, it might still be. I don't know. It's the same thing. I mean, when we start talking a little bit about the Millerites, you could not pitch a tent out here and fill it with 4,000 people like they did over and over and over back then. Why? Because we're home watching TV or DVDs, or we're running off to Walmart or whatever we're doing. Back then, there was nothing else going on at night. So the entertainment was go hear the preacher. You might or might not be converted, but that was the entertainment. So, there are things that have changed in our country, and you would not be able to draw the crowds today, just place after place after place where they pitch the great tent. The Millerites would pitch their great tent because things have changed.
Now, about the earthquake, we experience a lot of earthquake right now.
Right. And most of them we're not reacting to quite like that one, do we?
What I mean, yeah.
We blame God now. It's an act of God, act of nature, act of God. Back then, they saw it as pending judgment. This is a sign God's telling us to get ready.
So why is it that we have different attitudes?
Well, I suppose that
Science?
well, science would be part of it. Our whole culture has changed in terms of our orientation to God and religious and spiritual matters. So we're just living in a totally different time. There's lots of things that our pioneers experienced that we're not experiencing because we're so totally different in the way the world looks at things. All right, a little bit more about the falling of the stars, and I want to look at a few of these interesting people, and I would like to at least get started on Miller today since I've mentioned him a few times. According to some sources that I have been looking at about the falling of the stars, or the Leonid shower of November 12-13, 1833, one book said it was estimated that there were as many as 10,000 to 60,000 meteorites per hour. Now remember, they were not so, they were not very sophisticated. They didn't know much about meteorites and Leonids and all that. But they're estimates from scientists at that time. One estimate is that 1 billion meteorites fell over the United States and Canada from 2 to 5 a.m. that morning. The densest concentration in the morning was about 4 a.m. In appearance, the size of the meteorites varied, and these again are reports. So I don't know if I can believe part of what I'm saying, but this is what I'm reading in sources. That the meteorites varied from very small, like a pinprick of light hurling across the heavens, to at least one meteorite that appeared to eyewitnesses to be as large as the moon. Now, if you happen to see something the size of a full moon hurtling across the heavens, it might shake you up a little bit, even today, even though you know a lot more than they knew back then. The falling of the stars was observed from Canada to Mexico, from mid-Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific coast. And it seemed to be all coming from one part in the heavens, like a fig tree, shedding her figs. People were awakened. They remember the cities in those days didn't have lights like they have today. So this bright light awakened people. Now this is coming from some of these newspaper accounts that I have, where people would wake up because of the light out their window, and they'd go to see, and then here's this great display of what's going on in terms of this meteor shower. And again, what did it do? It pointed people to the Bible. It got them to looking at these great prophecies, end-time prophecies of Jesus and of Joel and of Daniel and of Revelation, just like the others had. And so even though these signs may not have quite as much impact today for us generally, in terms of how we look historically, how God was moving to condition people to study their Bibles, to find the great time prophecies, to realize that they were actually coming to an end, they're still significant, in my opinion, these signs that we've seen. Now, some of the unusual people, and I'm just going to mention 2 or 3, and since I work for the White Estate, I assume you will not be surprised that I'm taking names from Great Controversy. I'm going to give you more information than you're going to find in Great Controversy, but I'm going to take names of people that Ellen White mentioned. Not all, but some that she mentioned in Great Controversy. And the first person I want to talk about is a person that if you and I thought, hey, the great time prophecies of Daniel and Revelation are about to meet their fulfillment, and I need to find somebody down there on earth to get them studying the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation, I would not have chosen this person. I don't think you would either. Let me tell you why. His name is Manuel Lacunza. He was born in Chile. You got it. And not just any kind of Catholic priest. He was a Jesuit Catholic priest. Born in 1731 in Santiago, Chile. At 1747, at the age of 16, he was admitted on probation to the Jesuit order. After completing his 2-year vow, he studied philosophy, theology, and graduated with honors. But not just all the study that he did, he was also given the instruction, spiritual supervision of the younger students, and that wasn't enough to keep him out of mischief, so he became a professor of Latin and pursued studies in astronomy and geometry. In 1766, he took the 4 vows and became a Jesuit. Following year, 1767, King Charles III of Spain expelled the Jesuits from all of his New World possessions. So all the way from Mexico to the tip of South America, King Charles had every Jesuit rounded up, herded onto vessels, and they were sent back to Europe, or sent to Europe, because actually Lacunza was born. He wasn't born in Europe, he was born in Chile. And there he was first in Cadiz, Spain, and then he was in Imola near Bologna, Italy. We're told he became a recluse. He lived a life of piety and prayer. He spent 5 hours a day in study and prayer. And for 30 years, some here before he went and then over there in Europe, he engaged in a study of the Bible and the writings of the Catholic Fathers. And eventually, according to sources that I've read about him, he had read 1,000 volumes on church fathers, Catholic church fathers. Well, if you've read 1,000 volumes on any topic, you probably know a little bit about it, I would think. Anyway, by 1779, over there in Italy, where he finally ended up, he abandoned all the trips that he had been making to the libraries in Venice and Bologna and Rome and decided they weren't worth it anymore. He'd read all this information, he'd packed all this into his brain, but he decided there was only one book that was really worth spending your time on, and that's the Bible. And as he began to study the Bible, he came to the realization that there were 2 books in the book that especially fascinated him. And you know what those 2 books were? Daniel and Revelation. So here is a Jesuit Roman Catholic priest, almost in the shadows of the Vatican itself, studying Daniel and Revelation at precisely the right time in history, right there when God had told Daniel that things are going to be, seal it up till the time of the end. And now it's being opened. If that isn't enough to send a chill up and down your spine, you better go back and look at your Adventism again. I mean, this is exciting stuff if you ask me. Here he is. He doesn't realize he's fulfilling anything, but God's working through this most unlikely person right on time, as I say, in the shadows of the Vatican itself. Now, Lacunza came to some interesting conclusions, many of which we would not accept. But his real purpose was to get people, especially Roman Catholic priests, to study the Bible. He came to the conclusion that in any disagreement between the teachings of Scripture and the teachings of the Church Fathers, the Bible always takes precedence. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church teaches that you need to understand the Bible through the teachings of the Fathers. He said, well, I can't find that view in the Bible anywhere, that the traditions of the Church take precedence over the Word of God itself. He also discovered 2 comings of Christ. One resurrection before the millennium, when the righteous dead will be raised, and then another resurrection at the end of the millennium. So he did not accept the general view of both Protestants and Catholics that time, the view of Daniel Whitby, that the world's going to get better and better and better for 1,000 years, and then Christ is going to come. He said, that's not in the Bible. Can't find it at all. He discovered 2 judgments are depicted in Scripture, separated by much time. Well, he got into some trouble, though, with some of his other things he discovered. He discovered that the Antichrist was not some individual, such as Martin Luther or Wycliffe or somebody, that would come to harass the church. But instead, he says, it sounds to him like it is a great moral body of apostasy. Now, that was probably bad enough, and he might well have stopped there, but he didn't. He was an honest man, and he says that great moral body of apostasy displays characteristics of the Roman Catholic Church, of which, of course, he was a priest. That's not bad enough. He came to another conclusion, that the second beast of Revelation 13 and the harlot of Revelation 17 displayed characteristics of the Roman Catholic priesthood, of which he was a member. Now, how do you think that set with his superior there in his monastery or wherever it was? Not too good, not too well, but that's what he came to. And he wrote it all up in a lengthy manuscript, a handwritten manuscript, which entitled was, he wrote it in Spanish, entitled The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty. Rather than focusing on himself, he wrote under a pseudonym, Juan Josephat Ben Ezra.